David Smoak. And in studio with us, a guy we've known for quite some time. He covers or works for The Athletic, covers Nebraska football in Texas to do a lot of research and background to write something about the connections and roots of the Texas high school football coaches and Matt Rhule. Mitch Sherman in studio with us, who's been on the road for quite a bit. So you're down in town. Let's ask you, first of all, this. What has been now a couple of months later, what's it like in Lincoln? I know they've started, no, they don't start spring drills till March 20th, but what has been Matt Rhule era 2 months later?
Well, it's been pretty remarkable to see how excited Husker Nation has grown over Matt Rhule, and it's now 3 months. So November 26th, we're a little over 3 months, I think, if my math is right. And I think people have really begun to understand who he is and what he brings to Nebraska. It wasn't, when the hire was made and Trev Alberts announced the hire a couple days after Thanksgiving. I think there was initially a lot of excitement. It's like, hey, there's an NFL coach who's coming to Nebraska. But there was also some, hey, we've been down this road before with an outsider who came in from the NFL and was going to bring his system and, had his way of doing things. And, that hasn't worked. And, the homegrown coach hasn't worked. And, the former coordinator hasn't worked. So there's some hesitancy, or initially was some hesitancy on what Nebraska was getting. And, I think what people have seen over these 100 days or so is that, one, he's a great communicator. Two, he's extremely genuine in what he says he actually means and does. And then, three, he has a plan. This is a guy who has built 2 college programs, 2 for 2, in going to Temple and going to Baylor, coming up through the ranks at Temple, and then going to Baylor and fixing things. And, I wouldn't say it's all that similar what he has in front of him at Nebraska in comparison to Baylor or Temple, only from the standpoint that Nebraska's been losing. As far as resources, what he's inheriting with the roster, it's pretty starkly different, especially when he came into Waco in 2017 and inherited that situation. So, people are excited, genuinely excited at this point about everything that they've learned and seen firsthand from Matt Rhule in this time.
He was in the NFL for a few years, but can they even really think of him that way? Like, not like Bill Callahan, who was a near NFL lifer. Like, that's kind of a different comparison when you look at the NFL guy who comes in.
Yeah, it's not the same. Matt Rhule's a college guy who spent 3 years or 2+ years in the NFL, and I think if you go back to November 26th, the morning, or November 28th, the morning that the announcement came out, and it's like, okay, Nebraska, and actually even the week before that, in the days before Thanksgiving, it was apparent who Nebraska was zeroing in on to hire for this position. Right, I just mean right then at the very beginning, there was some hesitancy, like, okay, you're going to get an NFL coach. Is this going to be a situation similar to what Nebraska saw 18 years ago? And then I think the answer has been a resounding no, that he's a college guy, and his system is set up to work at a college program, which is the direct opposite of what Nebraska had with Bill Callahan when he came in to replace Frank Solich in 2004, who was a guy who started in college but then went and built his name, built his system in the NFL. Rhule's system just might not be fit for the NFL. I think the way that he emphasizes culture and the expectations that he has for everyone inside of his program, it just works so much better, seemingly, at the college level than it ever could at the NFL, where you're dealing with a 35-year-old father of 3 as your starting linebacker.
Yeah, I don't want to call it like rah-rah, but some of that rah-rah stuff, that kind of motivational, doesn't quite click with the 35-year-old, like you said, or the 30-year-old father of 3 or what have you, like it does with an 18-year-old kid. So I know we'll get into your trip here, but where did it kind of start for Matt Rhule, do you feel like, or where did he need to start with Nebraska football to start to get the transformation underway?
He started at home. That's what he did when he was at Baylor. He started here. He talked to people within the Texas High School Coaches Association. Actually, I think he started by talking to college coaches who had been successful in the state of Texas and asked them, what do I need to do to start at home? and they directed him toward the Texas High School Coaches Association. So he went there and put on the full court press, and there was nothing that he could do that was too much, too over the top, too polite, there was no task that was too small for Matt Rhule to take on himself when he got to Baylor, as it related to appealing to the Texas high school coaches. And it's not the same kind of group. He couldn't go hire 3 Nebraska high school football coaches and put them on his staff, because it's a state of 2 million people, and you just don't have the same the same depth in coaching talent at the high school level. Now, there are good high school coaches in Nebraska, and Nebraska signed 8 players from its own state. There were 15 about Power 5 signees from the state of Nebraska, which is a lot for Nebraska. I realize that's like a little corner of Dallas, but hey, for the state of Nebraska, Nebraska should get all of those guys, all of them that it wants. Maybe there's 15 Power 5 signees from the state of Nebraska in 1 year, and Nebraska wants 10 of them. Well, they should get 9 or 10 of those guys. That's just, it's a one-state program. And, yeah, there's going to occasionally be a kid who says, hey, I'm going to Oregon. There's nothing you can do. I want to go to Oregon, or I want to go to Oklahoma. There was a kid this year who wanted to go to Oklahoma, and there's probably nothing that anyone could have done to get him to come to Nebraska, no matter who the coach was. So you're going to miss out occasionally, but they should get almost all of them. So what he did, as important as Texas was to him when he got to Baylor, that's how important Nebraska was to him when he got to Nebraska. He didn't leave the state of Nebraska for about 10 days. He went to work. He went out to visit high schools. It was December. It was a contact period. He assigned Ed Foley, who from Baylor, to be the point man, to run point in the state of Nebraska. They used social media, and they just started to hit the ground. And by January, they had won people over. You started to hear the same kinds of things from Nebraska high school coaches and parents and players in the state of Nebraska that we had heard several years ago from the state of Texas.
What have the coaches you've met with or seen or spoken to, what's been their feedback on what you're doing, and also their thoughts about Matt?
Yeah, so in Texas, I've just been here today. I was at Arlington Martin this morning, where Matt Rhule went to find his tight ends coach, Bob Wager, who, of course, is a huge name in the state of Texas for all the work that he's done over a couple of decades up there in Arlington. I stopped by DeSoto. People know Claude Mathis, the coach there. Nebraska's actively recruiting players at DeSoto. I went to Temple, sat down with Scott Stewart, the head coach at Temple this afternoon. I'll be some other places the next couple of days. I wanted to hear it and see it myself as opposed to getting on the phone and talking with coaches. I wanted to go into the schools and see the kinds of things that Matt Rhule and his staff have seen, and be in the places where they've had conversations with high school seniors, with high school coaches, with assistant coaches, with guidance counselors. So I think it's been really enlightening from that perspective today to go to some of these places and just to hear the little stories, the little things that made a difference when he was at Baylor, and how he won a lot of the people over who then sent him players. And these are resources, again, now that he's in the Big Ten, that he's going to try to come back to Texas and tap. And if the first 3 months is going to be an indicator, he'll be successful at doing that.
I've noticed Ed Foley's tweets. He's been to every small to medium-sized town in Nebraska eating hamburgers and pizza and whatever local fare they have.
He knows how to play the game.
Yeah.
But again, the thing that I think people find when they meet him is that it's genuine. This isn't a situation where Ed Foley is going to Runza, which is the Nebraska, it's the Whataburger of Nebraska, and he's going there and he's ordering the sandwich and he's tweeting the picture of it, and then he's chucking it in the trash 10 minutes later. You really get the sense in talking, unless they're the greatest actors in the country for college football coaches, that it actually does matter to them. And Ed Foley will go into these schools, and some of these schools are places that Nebraska hasn't gone in to recruit a player in years. But he wants to go in and get to know the coaches and meet the people that he needs to meet and ask the questions that an assistant coach at Nebraska should know about a high school in the state of Nebraska, so that when somebody who's now an 8th grader becomes a 10th grader and an 11th grader, and they start getting recruited by Iowa and Kansas State and Oklahoma, that Nebraska has an edge because they were there 3 and 4 years earlier and developed these relationships. And some of that, amazingly, even in Nebraska's home state, even with Scott Frost, who oozes Nebraska, I mean, he is Nebraska, it wasn't happening. I think it was taken for granted by not just his staff, but other staffs that came before him at Nebraska over the last 20 years, that they would just get those players. So it took an outsider, truly a staff of outsiders. There's not a coach, a full-time coach on this Nebraska staff who has spent really any amount of time in the state of Nebraska. He retained one guy, Donovan Raiola, his offensive line coach, who's been at Nebraska for one season, didn't play at Nebraska, hadn't coached there previously. His brother played at Nebraska. It's a name now that people know with his nephew as the #1 player in the country out of Phoenix. That's it. That's the only connection there was to the previous staff among his 10 full-time assistants. There's some others on the support staff who have connections to Nebraska, but it took an outsider really to come in to begin to fix some of the problems that existed within the foundation, not just of the program, but around the state.
Yeah, how much did he just reinstill belief amongst the fan base in Nebraska football and the pride? I mean, I don't think the pride everyone knew, but just a belief that, like, hey, we belong, we deserve to be on a different level because it has been such a struggle seemingly for so long. There just seems like with Baylor, he came in one of the most downtrodden times there ever was. By the time he left, people were pumping green and gold. They were flinging it. They were there's a passion there that's never goes away, but how much has he kind of lit a fire under the fan base, I guess is what I'm asking.
I mean, I think that's still to be determined, but I think he's off to a good start. And, you know, it's not just him. It's his boss, Trev Alberts, who was an All-American at Nebraska and a big name. And, you know, people know him from his broadcasting career. And then he went to be the AD at a smaller Division I school, Nebraska Omaha. And he came back to Nebraska and fired Scott Frost after a year and a half on the job as the AD, and there's a kinship between Rhule and Alberts that you can't, again, not something you can fake. The two of these guys are very much on the same page with the way that they think and the way that they envision a program is supposed to work, and not just a program, but an entire athletic department. And you know, I won't say that Matt Rhule has anything to do with some of the successes that Nebraska athletics has experienced since he came in around December 1st. But I also think there's an energy around the place that has gone up several levels because of what he's brought, the positivity that he's brought, because he wants his football team to lead the way, not just with football, but with all athletics at Nebraska. And you know, as football goes, other things tend to go within that athletic department. And I will say that there's a little bit of something going on where you see the basketball team under Fred Hoiberg experiencing success for the first time in 4 seasons right here in these last 2 or 3 months. And Matt Rhule and his players are at these games, and they're getting people fired up, and they're bringing recruits, football recruits, like Dylan Raiola, the #1 player in the 2024 class who's sitting courtside at a game a couple of weeks ago. I mean, it's not like he's coaching the basketball team. It's not like he's coaching the wrestling team or the women's basketball team or the baseball team. But I do think that, and he said this, and Alberts has said this, that as football goes, other things go. And that's already started to, I would say, show itself in a small way.
You didn't get to know him really until were you at the coaches convention where you had a chance to sit down with him?
Yeah, in January.
And get to know him a little bit? Right.
I mean, of course, I saw him in November and December when he did press conferences, but the first time to get to be one-on-one and chat with him and get to know him was at the convention, and then multiple times since then.
So let's tell Mitch something we should tell him about Matt Rhule that Matt doesn't want us.
Yes, I'm all ears.
No, but he is someone who has a macro version of things, and he knows how to work it out on a micro level, I would say, with Matt Rhule. Mm-hmm. Like, he knows what the big picture is, and he knows the little steps to get there. Like, he knows that there's a lot of little things that a lot of coaches don't think. And it surprises me to hear that coaches at Nebraska just thought they could walk into a place and, with a red N on their shirt and be like, you.
Inside the state, yes.
After not doing that for a while. Like, that is strange, especially Scott Frost. To me, that one feels kind of strange that he wouldn't do that especially given how it happened with him, because that's what Tom Osborne did, was the relation. He was going to own the borders of that state. And then how Scott Frost never picked up on that was kind of surprising to me.
There are high school coaches in the state of Nebraska who say that visits that they got from Matt Rhule's staff in December and January were the first that they had received from coaches from Nebraska since Osborne retired. And Osborne...
That was 1997, by the way.
We're talking 25 years ago, a quarter century ago. And not to say that every staff that came through, Solich, Pelini, Riley, Frost, not to say that all of them dropped the ball entirely on the state of Nebraska. They've recruited and developed good players from within the state. But I think as far as having a true appreciation for what they needed to do, it has been very inconsistent. And Rhule has set out to fix that problem.
Yeah, one of the things when we saw him and the coaches, Garrett McGuire mentioned like getting off the plane 2 days after they'd announced that he was going to be there, and then people like the baggage guys going like, "Hey, how are the wide receivers going to be?" He's like, "I really haven't met any of them yet." Like,
May not even have had a roster yet.
Everywhere I've been in Texas today, in the schools that I've been, we've talked about Garrett McGuire, and there's a feeling in the state of Texas that there are big things ahead. And not just for Garrett. It's not just Garrett McGuire. You know, Susan Elza, everywhere I've been today also, I hear things about Dr. Elza and where she's going and, you know, what this position as the chief of staff for Matt Rhule can mean for her career. I don't get the sense that this is where she intends to land and spend the next 15 years. I mean, she's probably going to be an athletic director at a Division I college within a few years. Same kind of track for Garrett McGuire, who is the youngest coach in the Power 5 at having just turned 24 years old. But, you know, as I was discussing a few minutes ago with Scott Stewart down at Temple, he's been doing this for 15 years. When he was 9, he was sitting alongside his dad, Joey, breaking down film at Cedar Hill and getting a sense of what it was like to be a coach as a 9-year-old. Now, granted, this was like 2008, which is crazy to think that he was 9 in 2008 and now he's coaching wide receivers at a Power 5 school. But even the kids that I talked to today who've met Garrett, kids from these Texas high schools, Jeremiah Charles up at Martin, he's a wide receiver who signed with Nebraska in this 2023 class. He's 18 years old. He's 5 years or 6 years younger than Garrett McGuire, who's going to be his position coach. And I asked him, hey, what's that like for you to have a position coach, not a quality control coach or a GA, but a position coach, a guy who's in charge of everything that has to do with your career, who's 24. And he said, man, I love it. It's great. I can identify with him. You know, he's like me. We think the same. We talk the same. So, sure, there may be something about his inexperience where he's got to pick up on aspects of his job that other people can show him. But more than that, you know, Bob Wager, who's twice Garrett McGuire's age or more than twice his age, he says that he's learning as much from Garrett or more from Garrett than Garrett is learning from him. So it's really intriguing, and it's going to be so intriguing to watch his career because he's another guy I think is going to be doing things like what his dad's doing as the head coach at Texas Tech. You know, Garrett's going to be in a position like that probably before all too long.
All right, so you're going to head back. We appreciate you coming into our studio because we've had you on many, many times. What is your thought, just your own opinion, even if the Big Ten is fine? They're fine, and they've added USC and UCLA. That's in about a year. They're only going to get bigger, better, faster, stronger, and the SEC will do the same thing. What is your, just as a college football guy and fan, of what's going to happen, in your opinion? What eventually happens with the Pac-12?
Well, I mean, this is a fluid story. I mean, you asked me a week ago, I might have said something different than what I say right now, but you know, my colleagues at The Athletic, I'm keeping up with Max Olson's content that he's putting out and other writers about, you know, Stuart Mandel. You know, there's been news on this front with the Pac-12 potentially splintering. And I would say right here, right now, I think that's what's going to happen. I think the Big 12 is going to be a benefactor. Maybe the Big 10 is going to be a benefactor of the Pac-12 essentially breaking up if that's what ends up happening. I mean, the Pac-12 may be relegated to mid-major status before all that long, if there is a Pac-12 left in a couple of years. But right now, it seems like a feeding frenzy among the SEC, the Big Ten, with the Big 12, hungry and knocking on the door for some of what those conferences have got. And obviously the Big 12 has new schools entering next year, Texas and Oklahoma leaving the year after that. But I don't think the Big 12 is going anywhere. A few years ago we had this conversation and everybody thought the Big 12 is the one that's going to end up going away. When Nebraska left the Big 12, part of the fear was, is there going to be a Big 12?
Yep.
Is there going to be a conference? Nebraska needed a conference. It's not Texas. It's not Notre Dame. They had to be able to go to a place just because there aren't they need that TV revenue. They need what a major conference can add. So you can't blame Nebraska for jumping for the security that the Big Ten offered. But here we are, more than a decade after Nebraska left, and I think the Big 12 is positioned to probably take some of what the Pac-12 is ready to give.
They've been rated 3 times, and here they are on pretty solid ground.
Yeah.
They had Texas, OU recently, A&M and Missouri, and, of course, as you mentioned, Nebraska and Colorado. All right, man, great to see you. Appreciate it. You've been on with us. Now you get to see a little bit of at least what we do.
I'm impressed.
And,
I like this place.
Of course, we have a lot of different guests from The Athletic on our show as well, and you're one of them. Max, of course, we have him on weekly. Great to have him as well. Have a great trip. I'm glad everything worked out for you.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.
Mitch Sherman, theathletic.com, and this is 365 Sports. Petty Clinic Low T